In the autumn of 1887, in the high desert town of Garnet Ford, New Mexico Territory, a woman named Celia Voss paid $3.40 for a vault that had not been opened in 11 years. She did not pay that sum for the land it sat on. She did not pay it for the shell of the building around it, a collapsed adobe whose roof had caved the winter before and left the walls standing like the ribs of something long dead. She paid it only for the safe itself, a Mosler 3-drawer bank vault manufactured in Cincinnati in 1871, weighing somewhere near 800 pounds, abandoned in the ruin of the First Territorial Savings Bank of Garnet Ford, when that institution failed in the spring of 1876. The county had seized the building, stripped what was movable, and left the vault where it sat, because no one could persuade it to open, and no one cared enough to haul it out. The auctioneer, a dry-handed man named Pruitt, read the lot numbered twice before he understood that the bid was hers. Then he looked at the $3.40 and said, very slowly, that the county would not be responsible for transport. She said she understood. He looked at her once more, at the wool dress, the color of old cream, and the red shawl she wore, despite the heat of the afternoon, and wrote her name in the ledger. There were 11 men at the auction that day. 3 of them laughed. None of them could explain, afterward, exactly why the laughter felt wrong by the time they got home. If you have ever stood before something the world decided was finished and wondered whether the world was right, then stay with this story. It will take a little time. Some truths ask for patience. Celia Voss was 27 years old when she walked away from that auction with a receipt for an unopened vault. She had arrived in Garnet Ford 6 weeks before with $41, a mule named Perch, a leather satchel worn to the color of saddle bark, and a tool roll her father had packed the year before he died. The tools were his, not hers, by inheritance of blood alone, but by inheritance of 10 years' instruction. Because Horace Voss had been the finest safe-maker and locksmith in the Colorado Territory, and he had believed, with the particular stubbornness of a craftsman who had no sons, she had wished to. That was the fact her father never quite believed until his last months, when she sat beside him and drew the internal gear schematics of 3 different manufacturers from memory while he watched, and he said nothing, only nodded once and closed his eyes. Horace Voss died of a congestion of the lungs in the winter of 1885. He left behind the tool roll, a set of schematic drawings he had collected over 20 years, and the lease on a shop in Durango that Celia could not afford to maintain on her own. She had taken commissions where she found the mended hinges and cut keys and opened jammed mechanisms for households and merchants across southern Colorado, and then the work dried up because a hardware concern out of Santa Fe opened a branch and undercut every independent tradesperson within 50 miles, and she had come south looking for steadier ground. The shop in Durango had been her world for 10 years. Its back room smelled of machine oil and graphite and the faint sweetness of brass shavings, and she had learned in that room, at her father's shoulder, the particular discipline of listening to metal. Horace believed that a lock mechanism told you everything you needed to know if you were willing to stop talking long enough to hear it. He said this frequently, and meant it not as a metaphor but as a literal instruction. Stop making assumptions, stop projecting a sequence onto the tumblers, and instead attend to the actual feedback the mechanism was sending through the tools in your hands. It was the kind of knowledge that could not be written down cleanly, because the crucial part lived in the fingertips and took years to develop. He had begun teaching her at 17, not because she had asked, but because he recognized what he was seeing when she picked up one of his tools and held it correctly on the first attempt, without being shown. She had never taken the craft for granted. She had also never expected it to matter in the specific way it would come to matter, because her father had run an honest business in a fair-sized city, and the problems he solved were the problems of merchants who had lost their combinations and homesteaders who needed new mechanisms after a fire. The problems of institutions of county courthouses and territorial banks had been outside the ordinary range of his work. He had encountered them twice in 20 years when she was old enough to understand what she was watching, and both times he had approached the institutional mechanism with the same patience and attentiveness he brought to anything else. The institution's size did not overawe him. The mechanism was the mechanism, and the mechanism could be read. Garnet Ford was not steady ground. It was a town that had grown up around a silver strike in 1869, swelled through the middle 70s, and then contracted when the ore thinned and the bank closed, and 3 of the 4 Main Street businesses followed within a year. What remained was a reduced, cautious place, the kind of town that had learned to distrust newcomers, and especially to distrust newcomers who bid on things nobody else wanted. She rented a room above the dry goods store from a woman named Hatch, who was civil but not warm. She took her meals alone. She made no claims about her intentions with the vault because she had found in her experience that claims invited argument and argument consumed time she would rather spend working. What she knew, and what no one else in Garnet Ford knew, was the following. Mosler 3-drawer bank vaults, the 1871 series, were built with a patented dual-tumbler mechanism that used 2 independent dial sequences, a primary and a secondary, operating in tandem. The mechanism was considered uncrackable at the time of manufacture. The company was proud of this. They had published a technical brief about it in 1873, which her father had obtained and annotated in the margins, and which she had read until the paper softened at the folds. The dual-tumbler design had one documented weakness. If the primary dial was spun incorrectly during a forced entry attempt, a catch-in gauge that locked the secondary sequence in a fixed position. Locksmiths who did not know the design had repeatedly broken this catch over the years by forcing the primary, which destroyed the secondary and made the vault permanently unworkable without removing the entire mechanism and rebuilding it in a foundry. This was expensive and difficult, and it explained why 11 years had passed without anyone successfully opening the Mosler vault in the ruin of the First Territorial Savings Bank. What it did not explain was what was inside. The county records, which she had reviewed at the land office 2 days after her arrival, showed that the bank had been placed into receivership on the 14th of April, 1876 by order of the Territorial District Court. The receiver, a man named Arlen Spur, who had come down from Albuquerque, had cataloged the bank's assets and distributed them to creditors over the following 6 months. The vault was listed in his catalog as empty, its contents already disbursed. The building was seized for back taxes. The vault was noted as inoperable and of negligible salvage value. She read that catalog entry 3 times. Then she read the list of creditors and what each had received. The numbers did not balance. The bank had held at the time of its failure accounts belonging to 41 depositors. The receiver's payout to those depositors totaled $9,214. The receiver's own accounting showed assets recovered of $12,700. The difference was $3,486, attributed in a single line to administrative costs and liquidation fees. $3,486 in administrative costs for a 6-month receivership of a small territorial bank. She was familiar enough with the accounting of small commercial failures to know that this figure was wrong. A receivership of a bank this size, in a territory this remote, with assets of $12,000, would have cost a competent receiver somewhere between $300 and $600 in documented expenses, perhaps $800 if travel costs were exceptional and the legal review prolonged. Even a generous reading of the arithmetic could not make $3,486 in administrative costs credible. The number was too large and too specific at once. Numbers invented for the purpose of concealing a theft tended toward that quality, because the person setting them had been working backward from the amount they needed to hide rather than forward from actual expenses, and the precision became a kind of signature. She had not been looking for this. She had come to the land office to understand what the property records showed about the ruined building, to determine whether the structure remained legally encumbered, and whether her purchase of the vault through the auction created any claim she had not intended. She had found the building clear, the vault clear, and the receipt in her pocket legally sound. The discrepancy in the receivership accounting was something she had found because she read everything placed before her completely the way her father had insisted upon, because he said a locksmith who only read the parts of a document that looked relevant was the same as a locksmith who only turned a dial in the direction he expected the combination to lie. She had set the ledger down on the land office counter and looked at the clerk, a young man who had grown up in Garnet Ford and who knew its history, the way people know the histories of places that have disappointed them. She asked him if Arlen Spur still lived in the territory. The clerk said Arlen Spur had retired to a house in Santa Fe in 1877 and died there in 1882. She asked whether any record of the original bank accounts remained at the county level, the passbooks, the individual deposit slips, the internal ledger the bank itself had maintained. The clerk searched his files for a long moment. He found a notation that the original bank records had been transferred to the receiver upon his appointment in April of 1876 and had not been returned to the county at the close of the receivership. The transfer receipt bore Arlen Spur's signature. She stood with this information for a moment. Then she thanked the clerk and put on her shawl and walked back to her rented room. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking at the wall, which had a crack in the plaster running from the window frame to the ceiling in a line that reminded her, for no particular reason, of the way a tumbler sequence mapped across the interior of a lock. A record of deposits that had vanished into a receiver's hands, a vault no one could open, and a receiver who had died before he could retrieve what he had left inside it. The shape of it was legible. She had spent her adult life reading shapes. Then she unrolled her father's tool case on the desk and began taking stock of what she had. The tools were organized as her father had kept them, grouped by function and wrapped individually in soft leather sleeves, the tension wrenches 3 sizes. The dial caliper, which had been her father's great pride and which she had used more than any other instrument in her work, a slim, brass measuring instrument that could detect the finest variations in a tumbler's resistance. The stethoscope with its padded rubber earpieces for listening to the interior of a mechanism as the tumblers moved. The graphite powder and the small brush for lubricating mechanisms without introducing moisture. She checked each piece. She sharpened the 2 picks that had dulled. She oiled the caliper's hinge. Then she lay down on the bed and studied the ceiling and thought about what a dual-tumbler Mosler mechanism would feel like from the outside after 11 years of New Mexico winters and summers, and what it would need before it would tell her anything at all. She began her work on the vault the following morning. She rose before light and dressed and ate the bread and dried apple she had set aside the night before. She packed the tool roll into her satchel, tucked the schematic drawings in their oilcloth sleeve alongside it, and walked out into the pre-dawn street while the town was still dark. This was deliberate. She had found in years of working on difficult mechanisms that the early hours offered a quality of quiet that midday could not. The mind was less occupied by the world's noise. The hands were steadier. The ruin of the First Territorial Savings Bank stood at the south end of Garnet Ford's main street, behind the remnant of an iron fence that had once been painted black and was now the color of dried blood. The adobe walls were still solid, 2 feet thick and resistant to weather in a way that wood construction was not. The ceiling that had collapsed had come down in a single sheet, pulling with it the pine beams and the plaster lath, and the debris lay in a pile to one side of the vault that someone had partially cleared at some point, perhaps the receiver's men in 1876, perhaps a later scavenger. The vault itself stood against the rear wall, its face toward the street side opening, as though it had expected to be useful again and had been waiting. She had not seen the inside of the building before. At the auction, Pruitt had gestured toward the fence from the street and read the lot number, and she had looked through the fence at the pale shape of the vault against the rear wall, and that had been enough. Now she climbed through a gap in the fence where 2 of the iron uprights had rusted through at their bases and fallen, and picked her way through the debris field, stepping over a collapsed section of ceiling plaster, skirting the pile of pine beams. The light was coming up. The sky to the east was the color of pale copper, and the first edge of the sun threw a long shadow from the vault's right corner across the adobe floor. The vault was iron, painted originally in the deep bottle green, the Mosler Company favored in that period, though the paint had peeled and oxidized to a mottled greenish-brown rust halo spreading from every seam. The dial was intact. The handle was intact. The locking bar showed no deformation, which meant that whatever force had been applied to it over the years had not been sufficient to shear the mechanism, only to confirm that the secondary catch had engaged. Someone had scratched at the dial surround with what looked like a pry tool, leaving a series of parallel marks that had rusted over and become part of the surface. She knelt before it and did not touch it for a full 10 minutes. Her father had taught her this, the 10 minutes of looking before the hands move. A mechanism cannot be read in a hurry, he told her. It will not give anything to someone who is already assuming the answer. You look until you have stopped guessing and started seeing. What she saw was this. The dial had been spun incorrectly at some point. She could tell by the faint scarring on the dial face, consistent with a forced rotation against a catch, and the secondary tumbler was therefore frozen in a fixed position. The primary was not destroyed, because whoever had attempted the vault had not used enough force to break the primary catch entirely, only to engage it. This was the difference between a vault that could still be opened and one that could not. The secondary tumbler, frozen in position, was knowable. It was the one thing about the mechanism that 11 years had not changed. She placed her stethoscope against the dial surround and began to work. The process of feeling for a frozen secondary tumbler in a dual-lock Mosler was not taught in any manual she had ever read, because the mechanism had been designed to prevent exactly this. Her father had developed a technique over several years of working with Mosler products, a method of applying graduated rotational pressure to the primary dial while listening for the characteristic double click that indicated the secondary was aligned, not because the secondary was moving, but because the primary's own engagement sequence passed through a single window where both mechanisms briefly resonated at the same frequency. The window was perhaps a quarter turn wide at a specific point in the primary sequence that varied by serial number. The serial number of this vault was stamped in the casting at the lower left corner of the doorframe. She checked it against her father's schematic drawings, which he had annotated with the serial ranges and their corresponding primary windows. The vault fell within the third range. The window was between the 19th and 21st position of the primary dial. She worked for 2 hours on the first morning. The dial was stiff from years of non-use, and she applied graphite powder with her brush, working it into the dial's mechanism through the space around the shaft. She did not force anything. She turned the primary through its range slowly, listening, feeling through the stethoscope for any change in the texture of the mechanism's sound. On the first morning, she found nothing definitive, but she found the ghost of the window, a slight change in resistance at the 20th position that was different from what she felt everywhere else. She made a mark in her notebook and went back to her room for the night. Several of the townspeople had watched her work from a distance. By evening, Mrs. Deeber Hatch had heard from her neighbor that the woman in the upstairs room was doing something peculiar with the old bank vault, Mrs. Mess. Hatch relayed this to Celia over the supper table without comment, and Celia said yes, that was right, and ate her cornbread. By the second morning, there were 4 people who found reasons to be near the south end of Main Street. A boy of about 12 sat on the fence rail until his mother called him away. 2 men from the feed operation at the other end of the street stood in the doorway of their building and watched without pretending otherwise. An elderly woman in a black dress walked past 3 times at irregular intervals. Celia did not acknowledge any of them. She knelt before the vault, as she had the day before, and began at the 20th position. The second morning was slower. The first application of graphite powder had worked itself into the mechanism overnight, and the dial moved with less resistance than it had the morning before, which changed the quality of the feedback in her hands and required her to recalibrate her touch. She worked through the primary sequence 12 times, feeling for the resonance her father had described as a faint, sympathetic vibration, like the moment before a church bell rings when the metal is still gathering itself. He had used that image specifically. She had never heard a church bell ring in the way he meant, that inner thickening of the air before the clapper struck, until she was 22 and a steeple bell in Durango rang directly above her head during a roof repair. It sounded like the mechanism speaking a half beat before it committed to the sound. She understood what he had been trying to teach her then, and she understood it again now, kneeling in the dust. She did not hear it until midway through the 8th repetition, and then she stopped and went back and heard it again, a sound so slight that she held her breath to be sure she was not imagining it. She was not imagining it. The secondary was aligned at one specific position within the window. She could feel it not as a sound exactly, but as a change in the texture of the silence inside the mechanism. The way a room sounds different when it is empty versus when it holds something. The primary had not moved the secondary, but both mechanisms were speaking to each other through the material of the door, and she could hear them. She wrote the position down in her notebook. She set the tools in the primary at that position and held them steady, and picked up the tension wrench for the secondary's surface indicators, a series of small notches on the secondary dial face that a practiced hand could read through feel alone. The notches were dust-clogged. She applied the graphite brush and waited and applied it again. The dust was fine, 11 years of high desert air working through the gap around the dial shaft, and it had settled into the notch recesses like silt. She worked each notch clear, with a pick so narrow it had no formal name in her father's catalog, only a number, and which she had always thought of as the listening pick because it was too fine for force and could only be used to feel. She worked for 3 more hours. She did not rush. The vault opened at 2:30 in the afternoon on the second day. There was no dramatic clank, no great groan of iron. The locking bar drew back with a sound like a sigh, and the door, counterweighted in the Mosler fashion, swung a quarter of the way open on its own before she caught it. The air that came out was old and cold and carried the smell of iron and dry paper and something faintly mineral, a smell she had encountered before in sealed spaces, the smell of time that had been trapped. She did not open the door further for a moment. She sat back on her heels and let the cold air come to her. Behind her she heard someone make a sound, one of the watchers at the fence, and she did not turn around. Inside the vault, in the center shelf of the 3 drawers, was a leather satchel, dark with age, and sealed at the top with a brass clasp gone green. In the top drawer were 4 stacks of banknotes bound with paper bands that had dried to brittleness and split along their creases. She counted the notes carefully, twice, setting each stack in order on the vault floor. The total was $2,940, a sum specific enough to mean something. It was not a round number. It was a calculated remainder. In the bottom drawer were 3 sealed envelopes, the wax on 2 of them still intact, and a bound ledger. She took the ledger out first. It was a standard accounting book of the kind any bank would have kept covered in black cloth, with the spine reinforced in leather, and the pages within were dense with handwritten entries in the careful script of a bank clerk who had been thorough. The dates ran from January 1872 through March 1876, 2 months before the bank's failure. Every account was named. Every deposit and withdrawal was dated. The balance columns were carefully summed at the bottom of each page. It was the accounts book of the First Territorial Savings Bank of Garnet Ford. It was complete. It was not the ledger that had been presented to the Territorial District Court in the receivership proceeding. She understood this immediately, in the way that a person understands something they have half known was true. She sat for a long time in the dust of the ruined building with the vault open before her, and the ledger in her lap, and the afternoon light coming through where the roof had been falling at a slant across the open pages, and she read through enough of it to understand the shape of what she was holding. The receiver, Arlen Spur, had presented a falsified set of accounts to the court. The real ledger showed total deposits at the time of the bank's failure of $15,600, not $12,000. He had undercounted by $2,900, and that sum, plus the additional $500 he had shaved from the administrative cost line, had gone into this vault in banknotes, and been left here under the assumption that the vault could never be opened without destroying its contents. He had, apparently, intended to return and retrieve the money at some future time. That he had died in Santa Fe without doing so suggested that he had been unable to arrange the retrieval without drawing attention. The depositors who had been underpaid were named in the real ledger. She could read them, every one, across 8 years of handwritten account entries. There were 41 names. She recognized 11 of them as people who still lived in Garnet Ford, or whose families did. One name she recognized without expecting to, Perla Dunn, widow, account opened 1874, balance at closure $98. The Dunns still lived on the edge of town. She had bought flour from a woman named Dunn at the dry goods store on her 3rd day in Garnet Ford. It was this recognition, more than anything else, that settled the question of what she would do next. She closed the vault door. She placed the ledger, the envelopes, and the banknotes in her father's leather satchel. She locked the vault's primary mechanism by spinning the dial, which she could do now from the outside, and stood and walked to the fence where several people had gathered. There were 7 of them by then. She looked at their faces and said, in a voice that carried but did not rise, that the vault had contained bank records and a sum of money, and that she would be taking both to the Territorial Land Office in the morning, and that anyone who had held an account at the First Territorial Savings Bank of Garnet Ford should come to the Land Office in the next 2 weeks and present their deposit record if they had one. One of the men at the fence, a rancher named Colby, who had laughed at the auction, said nothing. He simply looked at her for a moment, and then looked away. She walked back to her room. She set the satchel on the desk. She sat down in the chair and did not move for a long time. Mrs. Hatch knocked on the door at 7 o'clock to say that supper was on the table. Celia said she would be down in a moment. She put the satchel under the bed, within reach of where she slept. That night, the town of Garnet Ford stopped speaking to her. She understood this the way she understood most things, through evidence rather than explanation. She had supper at the table with Mrs. Hatch, as she always did. Hatch passed the bread and the beans and said nothing beyond what politeness required. There were no sounds from the street outside her window that were different from any other evening, and yet the quality of the silence was different, the specific silence of people choosing not to gather and discuss something that sat too close. She lay in the dark with her hand on the satchel under the bed and listened to it. The town was not hostile. She thought about this carefully. She had lived through genuine hostility, the kind that was personal and aimed, and she knew its texture. This was something else. This was a community that had organized itself around the story that the bank's failure had been misfortune, impersonal, and no one's fault. And she had come from outside and told them in a level voice, at the fence, that the story was incomplete. A place needed time to find its footing when the ground shifted. She was not entitled to more than time. She slept. In the morning, she rose before light again, dressed, and checked the satchel. The ledger was where she had placed it. The banknotes were secured inside the leather wallet from the center shelf. The 3 envelopes, which she had broken the seals on the night before and read by lamplight, remained in the satchel's front pocket. 2 of the envelopes contained written statements, each bearing Arlen Spur's signature, describing the sums he had diverted and his rationale, written in the deliberate prose of a man who wanted a record in case he needed leverage at some future point. The 3rd envelope contained a certificate of deposit at a bank in Santa Fe for $2,000, drawn in 1877 and never cashed. He had apparently been cautious enough to intend a record and not cautious enough to destroy it when he died. The dry goods store, when she passed it with the satchel over her shoulder and perch saddled in the street, was open but quiet. Mrs. Hatch watched her go from the doorway without speaking. It was not hostility, exactly. It was something closer to the collective held breath of a place that had been told something true and had not yet decided how to receive it. She rode to the county seat, a town called Mira Wells, 32 miles north, on a road that climbed through pale scrubland and then descended along a dry wash into a valley where cottonwoods still held their leaves, gold and brittle. The morning was cold and clear, and the high desert was the color of bleached bone, under a sky she could have described as empty, except that it was too complete to be empty. She presented the ledger and the envelopes and the banknotes to the county recorder at Mira Wells, a meticulous woman named Alcott, who had been in the position for 9 years, and who read through the documents in a silence so deliberate it had its own particular weight, like the weight of a mechanism before it commits to a sound. When she finished, she looked up from the ledger and said, her voice even and administrative, that this would require the attention of the Territorial District Court. She asked Celia to wait. Celia waited for 2 hours in the anteroom, and a deputy court clerk came and took a statement from her, and she gave the statement in the same level voice she used for most things, naming dates and observed facts in the sequence of her work on the vault, and the clerk wrote it down. She rode back the same day, arriving in Garnet Ford after dark, unsaddled Perch and rubbed him down and gave him water and the last of the dried corn from her pack, went upstairs and slept. The process of the county's investigation took 4 weeks. Celia remained in Garnet Ford during that time, not because she was required to, but because she understood that leaving before the process concluded would communicate something she did not mean, and she had found over the years that the things you communicated without speaking had more weight than the things you said. She extended her arrangement with Mrs. Hatch, paying for 2 more weeks in advance, and resumed her meals at the table and her mornings with the tool roll laid out on the desk, keeping the tools in order and the caliper clean. The town's silence lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, Perla Dunn came to the fence of the ruined building while Celia was inside oiling the vault's hinge, which she had done as a matter of habit, the same way she might service any mechanism she had opened, and asked through the fence whether the woman inside was the one who had found the bank records. Celia came to the fence and said, "Yes." Perla Dunn was a small woman with gray hair cut close under a dark bonnet, and she had the look of someone who had worked long past the age when work becomes difficult. She said she had held an account at the First Territorial when it failed. $98. Her husband had been alive then, and it had been their household savings. Celia said she understood, and that the county recorder at Mira Wells had the real ledger, and that anyone with an account should contact the court clerk there. Perla Dunn looked at her for a moment. Then she said quietly that she had been told for 11 years the money was simply gone. Celia said yes. She said that was what the falsified records were intended to produce, and that they had been effective for 11 years because the vault could not be opened. Perla Dunn nodded once, the particular nod of a person absorbing a truth they are not certain how to use yet, and walked back the way she had come. After that, the town began to speak to her again, not warmly, not with the ease of neighbors, but in the cautious, measured way of people who have revised their estimate of someone and are not ready to announce the revision. The boy from the feed operation brought a message from his employer, asking whether she had experience with padlocks, as one of their storage doors had a mechanism that had been sticking for months. She said she did, and she looked at the padlock, and the problem was a piece of grit in the keyway, which she cleared with the narrow pick in less than a minute and did not charge for. The Territorial District Court appointed a replacement receiver to review the original proceedings, compare the 2 sets of accounts, and determine which deposits had been underpaid and by how much. The calculation was not simple because interest across 11 years and the partial distribution that had already occurred complicated the arithmetic, but the underlying sum was unambiguous: $2,940 in banknotes recovered from the vault. Erlen Spur was dead and could not be prosecuted. His estate, administered by a nephew in Santa Fe, was assessed for the full amount. The nephew paid a portion in cash and negotiated the balance down to something the court accepted in final settlement, as such negotiations between estates and territorial courts tended to go. The certificate of deposit from the 3rd envelope was presented as evidence and contributed to the assessment. The outcome was not the full recovery the ledger showed was owed. It was a considered fraction of the right number, delivered 11 years late, by a court working through procedures that had not been designed for circumstances quite like these. It was more than nothing. 11 years of silence had produced nothing. The first person to receive a check from the settlement was Perla Dunn. She was at the land office when the checks were distributed. She stood near the door and said nothing. Perla Dunn, who was 63, and had worked in the dry goods store for the better part of 2 decades to make up what the bank's failure had taken from her savings, received her settlement and looked at it for a moment, and then looked across the room. Their eyes met briefly. Perla Dunn gave a small, grave nod. Not gratitude, not warmth exactly, something more durable than either. Acknowledgement. Celia returned the nod and stepped outside. She had not intended to. There was no safe-making commission in a town this size to sustain a living, and the work was finished. she settled her account with Mrs. Hatch, who shook her hand this time without explanation for the change, and Celia accepted the hand and did not remark on it. She loaded her tools back into their leather roll and secured them in the satchel. She checked Perch's shoes and found the left front wanting a nail, which she drove herself with a tack hammer from the dry goods store. She paid for the nail. The morning she left, Colby the rancher was mending fence on the near side of his property, which ran alongside the road she would take north. He was working with his back to her and did not turn when she passed. She did not call out to him. The fence posts he was setting were straight and even, and she noted this with the same attention she gave to everything, not judgment, simply the habit of a person who had been trained to see what was actually there. She had spent $3.40. She had recovered $2,940 in banknotes and the evidence that allowed the courts to recover a portion of what was owed to 41 families in a town that had spent 11 years believing the loss was simply bad luck, a bank that had failed, money that was gone the way money in failed banks went. It was not bad luck. It had been taken. The difference mattered. What she took with her from Garnet Ford, beyond the $3.40 still in her own pocket, was the tool roll, the satchel, the schematic drawings her father had annotated in his careful hand, and the knowledge that the dual tumbler Mosler mechanism, the mechanism everyone in the trade had decided was inoperable, was something she could read. That knowledge had a value she had not yet fully calculated, because there were other vaults of that series in the territory and other county records she had not yet reviewed. The November wind came off the high desert as she rode north, cold and sharp and carrying the smell of coming snow. She pulled the red shawl tighter. Perch walked with his characteristic steady patience, ears forward, reading the road. Do you think a town is ever ready to learn that what it accepted as permanent loss was made to look that way? Leave your thoughts below. And if you would like another story of a woman who found the truth hidden inside a thing the world decided was worthless, there is one waiting. She rode for an hour before she stopped on a low rise to rest, perch and look back at Garnet Ford, which from this distance was a cluster of small shapes in an enormous pale country. The main street a thin line, the ruined bank building distinguishable from the others by the way its walls caught the morning light. The vault was still in there. She had not taken it. It was not hers. But it was open now. It had been closed for 11 years and told everything it knew in 2 days to a woman who had learned to listen. In the satchel, nested in the leather tool roll, the dial caliper her father had given her, rested in its worn sleeve brass and precise, the instrument of a trade that asked nothing more than patience and a willingness to hear what was already there. The road ahead ran straight and empty and long. The desert went on in every direction, muted and vast and indifferent. She had learned, in the 2 years since her father died, that indifference was not the same as hostility, and that a place did not have to welcome you for your work to matter in it. Garnet Ford shrank behind her until it was a smudge, and then nothing. The sky was wide and pale, and the wind was steady. She rode north.